This is a pretty exciting session. I mean, just personally speaking, a lot of my worlds are colliding here, which is great. But we have with us again Neha and Faris, but we're also joined by Augusta. Um, Titled Thinking Through Multispecies Ethnography, just also kind of picking up from some of the points we made in the last discussion. This particular session considers the ethics and methods of multi-species urban ethnography through a focus on Neha's current research about stray cat care in the UAE. We'll focus on questions of consent, community source data, and the ability to access non human subjective experiences. The session will include a discussion with photoethnographer and artist Auguste, who's currently working on a multi species project in Abu Dhabi. And just to kind of briefly introduce or give you a little more context of Augusta's past work. She's a photographer, filmmaker, and writer living in Abu Dhabi. Thematically, her work explores interpersonal relationships, often using sociological inputs, and also grapples with broader ecological concerns. Her practice pursues new tonalities, constructing narratives of reclamation and agency against dominant forms. She studies her subjects and the manipulation of modernity through a feminist leftist lens. But I won't take up any more of your time. I will let you guys do the talking.
All right, so welcome back, everyone. I feel like this is a cousin session for the previous session, although we're talking about a different subject or perhaps a slightly different focus, but I feel like the questions and the approaches are very similar, and I hope this comes out through this session. So, Neha, I think it's a good place to start if you can just kind of say a few words about to elaborate what your project is about, and we can start from there.
So some of you I recognize in the room were here for my individual session a couple weeks ago on stray cats, and I thank you for coming and for sharing your photographs and your experiences. So some of this is going to hopefully not be too boring in terms of repetitiveness, but I'm currently working on a project that's looking at stray cat care, informal stray cat care in the UAE, and some of the questions that I'm asking are how does caring for stray cats produce forms of human, non-human kinship, and how might those forms of kinship mitigate some of the loneliness and precarity of being an immigrant in this country, especially somebody who's, left their family behind or works a very lonely kind of job. Like we often see security guards and night watchmen, they're by themselves all night long, and they often form these relationships with stray cats. And I'm also really interested in thinking about how stray cat care becomes a site of politics. There's a lot of criticism about the lack of animal welfare policies in this country that are, more formalized. And it seems to me that this is one topic that people are willing to criticize the government about, and it also becomes a site for people from different national, race, and class backgrounds to actually form solidarity and friendship around the care of cats. We see this in different neighborhoods, et cetera. And some of it we saw in the session the previous session, someone had posted a video, I think, that really summarized this well, where it was a WhatsApp conversation back and forth between him and a security guard, where he was looking for a stray cat that he was going to rescue, and the security guard is like sending him phone calls and messages back and forth, and this would not be someone who necessarily. These two people might not necessarily have had a connection with each other in any other context. So that's something that I'm looking at. But for the purposes of this particular session and for my time here in the research rooms, I've been really interested in thinking through the question of non-human subjectivity itself. What does it mean to have cats as interlocutors? Can we access their subjective experiences? What are the ethics of accessing their subjective experiences?
So, as per the bio that Shamma has kind of shared with us, you have previously worked, and I mean, I've read a lot of your work, but you have previously worked on issues of labor, migration, and also, I mean, higher education, American higher education in the Gulf. So, how did you end up writing about cats. I mean, this kind of seems. But also, how do you feel like cats or your current research kind of draws on your previous work as well?
It's a very good question. Besides being a crazy cat lady, I do think that there is something. So yeah, there is. Actually, let me give you an example, right? So when I was doing my research, my dissertation research was in Dubai. It was in the older, now more gentrified neighborhoods around the Dubai Creek, Dera, Bur Dubai, Karama, places that were primarily South Asian dominated. And I would walk around and, sometimes meet people through like carrying my cat treats around, and like I would see a stray cat in front of like a restaurant, and I'd feed it, and then I'd start talking to the person. Like, so I actually, stray cats have mitigated my my like, they've been there this whole time in terms of like being part of my ethnographic experience of this city. But I was very anthropocentric because I'm an anthropologist, and I wasn't really thinking about those kinds of non-human encounters. There's one encounter I remember that I will never forget. And this is well after I had done the dissertation research. It was around 2010. And I was in Barsha with a friend of mine. And this was when Barsha was basically Mall of the Emirates and a bunch of empty sandlots, right? And we were crossing through a sandlot. And we see, she was also a crazy cat person. We see like 20 cats. So we start petting the cats and talking to them. And then this Indian man it's basically an empty construction site because this is post-recession, right? So it's a dead construction site. And this Indian man is in a trailer on the construction site. His job is to be the security for the trailer, right? He comes out to talk to us, and he basically tells us that that he's taking care of all of these cats. He's feeding them, even though he hasn't had his salary paid in a long time. His job is just there by himself, right? And he basically said, I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for these cats. These are my family. And so, at that moment, I kind of, when we first had that conversation, my friend and I went and got food for him and everything like that. And we thought, oh, okay, this is a really terrible post-recession story. But look at the resilience of this person and look, et cetera. But then when I started thinking back, like starting to get more interested in animal studies, I realized that this is not just a story of a man. It's a story of a man and his kinship with the stray cats. And so this is how I got to, this is an immigrant story of Dubai, a very common immigrant story of Dubai, right? Of loneliness, of precarity, especially in a recession. And we see the same kind of precarity now post-COVID. So I feel like the precarities of the cats and the precarities of the people are intertwined. And that's kind of where I want to situate this project.
It's amazing that this isn't like an analogy that you're making. You're talking quite literally, right, about this kind of kinship. And also, but what I find really fascinating about your project is that although you're talking about cats, you draw a lot on issues of race, right? Mentioning issues of also, but theories of race. And so how do you think race and animality, or the theories of race and animality, kind of speak to each other? How does it figure into your work?
So some of the best work in animal studies, in my opinion, is coming from people who are working on critiques of humanism, and particularly looking at how the concept of the human itself is one that is based on animality, but also on race, right? Who we define as human versus not human enough has been the seeds of racial capitalism, colonialism. So, on one hand, you'll have, and we started this conversation in the previous session, you'll have people saying, well, why would you focus on animals when we haven't even taken care of people? There's so many people that are marginalized and dealing with colonialism and racism and all of this. But there's also a lot of primarily Black feminist scholars who are coming out and saying, we need to do away with the concept of the human, because the concept of the human is what got us here in the first place, right? To this place where we have these kinds of hierarchies, and that there needs to be kinship and solidarity, that a liberation movement cannot be a liberation movement for humans alone when we're classifying non-humans as property, and we're building, how can we build a liberation movement on the severe, without thinking about the severe exploitation and lack of rights of the non-human.
But also, okay, so if I mean, when it comes to race, there has been a lot of rich. Okay, one article specifically comes to mind, which is can the subaltern speak, right?
Yes.
And in your project, to kind of draw on the same parallel, your project raises interesting questions about consent when it comes to and the ethics of having cats as interlocutors, right? And so how do you do? I mean, how are you? Can cats speak in your project? Do you think that cats can speak? If so, how do they speak? How are we able to listen to them as well?
Okay, so actually, I want to kind of go back and connect that to the previous question,
Yes.
right? And this speaks to these traditional ethnographic methods, right? Because there's always been this question of the traditional anthropology is the colonizer or the global north western ethnographer goes to the subaltern place, like the village. It's always about studying down, right? And these questions of representation and speaking for. And now we use terms like interlocutors so that we can feel better about ourselves. In terms, but at the end of the day, it's usually we're writing in a language that the interlocutor is not going to be accessing. Even if they speak English, we're writing in jargon that they can't necessarily access, right? So that question has always been there. In the case of the Gulf, right? We have to think about the kind of dehumanization of so many different groups of humans. And I kind of want to, and what does it mean when you have like a Human Rights Watch report coming out and talking about the voiceless migrant laborers, like who are toiling away in the heat? Like, we're removing their voice, like thinking of them as voiceless, right? We're removing their agency, we're removing their humanity in those representations that claim to be about improving their lives. And that's something that I've been critiquing in my writing for a long time. So I think that question of who can speak and who can speak for is already there, even in the human strata of Gulf studies, right? And there's this wonderful scholar, Neha Vora, who works on animal studies in India. And she critiques this, can the subaltern speak? I think it's her, I need to go and double check. But basically saying that, so can the subaltern speak? This very famous post-colonial piece of writing by Gayatri Spivak is looking at the quote-unquote subaltern, the most powerless person, right? Within the context of colonized India. It's a woman who commits suicide, and she's using this figure to kind of talk about voice and are there people who have no voice? And what Dave says is she spoke, right? The act of suicide itself is a speech act. So what are we doing if we just say the subaltern can't speak when she's literally speaking? She spoke with her life, right? And within the context of animal welfare, very similar things happen where we're the voice of the voiceless. But cats are not voiceless. You all know this, right? If a cat doesn't want to talk to you, cat won't talk to you. If a cat wants to talk to you, the cat will talk to you. So I am really interested in the kind of like these kinds of questions of like, we can ask the same questions of the way we represent and treat humans as we do non-humans. What are we erasing if we presume that certain persons, human or non-human, don't have any kind of agency, don't make any kinds of choices?
I would love also to hear more about how this is translated in terms of methods. So I think this is a great point to turn to to Auguste, who's working on a multi-species photoethnography project in Abu Dhabi. So I'll find my way out and leave you to.
Great. I'm going to sit there so I can watch your presentation, okay?
Great.
And
Awesome.
I just wanted to say that I invited Auguste here because I feel like some of the wonderful work that she's been doing is answering some of those questions that I have. And we wanted to do this kind of bridge work through the research rooms between the art world and ethnography. And I'm just really excited for you guys to see her photo ethnography and how she's been thinking through, and listen to her talk about how she's been thinking through her work.
Thank you, Neha. Before I begin, how can I communicate? Okay, I was ready to come up with a hand signal language. Okay, nice. Before I begin, let me come clean and just say that I am having a wild, wild day. Today was the first time that I tried to put my cat in a pet boarding facility, and she got rejected from 3 different centers. And for the first time in my life, I found myself protesting at the security checkpoint of just a pet hotel, being like, she was born here, she's supposed to go there. Let her in. But thank you so much, Neha, for inviting me. So as mentioned, I'm a photographer, an artist researcher. Among several recurring themes in my work, there is community and ecology. And this particular project that I was invited to talk about is one that marries the two, community and ecology. And I just want to preface this by saying that ethnography, in my case, comes with a big asterisk. I'm more of an artist, and I would say that maybe a better way of describing it is that my research is of ethnographic interest. But this project has been in the works for a bit over half a year now. It is focused on what could be called urban nature in Mina Zayed, which is a neighborhood in Abu Dhabi. It is the old port. And my curiosity lies in the more than human community and multi-species relationships within that neighborhood, within the urban industrial grid of warehouses. And Mina Zayed, actually, as a neighborhood, it has a very particular history, and there's a reason why I chose it as a case study for the project. So if you look at the map of Abu Dhabi, the area outlined is my research site. This is actually an older image captured by the International Space Station. If you look closely, you'll see that many of the islands are not bridged yet. There's Sadia, there's Reem Island. So it's also, you can see kind of the development just off the city center, and you can also see the location. So this neighborhood is centrally located. It is directly connected to the Corniche, basically the very heart of the city. And the port itself, it was opened in 1972, named after the Lake Sheikh Zayed. It was the very first urban port in the city, commissioned by Sheikh Zayed himself to facilitate international trade. It was basically the very first spot in the city where large industrial ships could dock, and it was a point of contact for Abu Dhabi to the rest of the world. And it was in very heavy use for about 3 decades. And then in around 2005, it was announced that most of the commercial activity would be moved to a new port, Khalifa Port, which construction for it began in the late 2010s. And so in 2014, most of the activity was moved to that new port, and Mina Zayed kind of entered this moment of hiatus. So there were around 30 years of really intense commercial activity, trade, and all the warehouses were full and there was constant movement. And then for the next 20 years or so, there were all these different proposals and ideas of what could be done with the area. So there could be a media campus, there could be the tallest building in the world, as you see there, which was before Burj Khalifa was constructed. But so many proposals came and went, and at some point, the neighborhood came out of this limbo that it was stuck in. Sorry, one second. It came out of this limbo when, in around 2015, it was announced that the area would be revamped into this homegrown cultural district. kind of similar to what El Sakal is right now. So you have this infrastructure of all these warehouses, these large streets, and this is one of the renders for the area. And during this time, I think what's important to note is that after 30 years of intense human use, commercial use specifically, while the area was stuck in that limbo, life there continued. And so all the plants that were brought in either as landscaping or that managed to disperse seeds as part of the trade, all the cats that gathered there, because on ships there were fish. And so the cats know that fish is good. And during that time, it was basically there just unchecked. And so in seeing all these new proposals and vendors, for my project, I'm mostly interested in what is rendered basically as a blank slate in the vendors, because it would make you think that, you are developing this luscious, gorgeous, creative community in an area that is otherwise empty, but that is really not true. And so I started imagining how I would be able to map out basically just all the more than human life that exists there. The first thing that I did was print out a large map of Mina Zayed, and I began mapping, making sense of the communities that actually exist there within that grid. But actually, I abandoned that approach very, very quickly because I wanted to look at the neighborhood from the more than human perspective. I didn't want to look at it as a constructor, as a developer. I wanted to see actually the more than human life there. And as I was looking at that 2D map, I was actually pushing forward that same human-centric, technocentric perspective because the multi-species community there, the more than human agents, they don't care about the grid. And what is basically represented as just this arbitrary line are actually wide streets, and that's where most of the life that I was interested in was happening, is happening still. And so within those, trying to think like how I'd be able to access the actual life that is happening there rather than just simply making notes of where what is. This is a video kind of showing what those streets look like. And so as you can see, it's really not just a line. There are different habitats, even just within a single street. There are layers of, first of all, the inside of the warehouse. Then there's foliage just outside the warehouses. And then there's streets. And then on the other side, it's the same thing all over again. And all of these create these basically micro habitats. So I started reimagining how I could observe these sites if I ignore the traditional urban mapping. And instead I wanted to focus on how these species make home in the area, how their lives are shaping and shaped by the environment itself. And as Holmberg notes, the animals really don't care. Like the city was not made for them, but it is kind of humbling to know that like they make home there, regardless of whether it was built for them or not. And then I was basically just thinking, how can I access all these different layers, those micro habitats, but also to figure out like how can I see how the animals move through it. And so my first step here was actually to limit my view of Mina Zaya to the subjective point of view. So rather than even referencing the maps, only approach it from what I see from on the ground. And I want to see what happens on the ground, which, sounds good on paper, but how do you actually do it? So I became concerned basically with building a relationship with the animals there, namely the cats, initially just the cats. And I started questioning how I could build rapport with these animals that are very aware of my presence, but again, there is a certain language barrier. And in these clips, you can see my Snow White-like attempts of making friends with the cat colonies. And I embraced the idea of exchange or giving back. And so, at least in my mind, considering that I was there every day taking photos and notes, I figured that the least that I could provide for the cats was food. To establish a certain, I know, in my eyes, that was almost an honorarium to them for being interlocutors. in my project. And because I was interested in the habitats as a whole, and my presence was invariably subjective but also intrusive to what happens there outside of the human activity, I focused on becoming part of the habitat. I built a routine where I essentially became an actor of that habitat story. So it was not just me going there to take notes, it was not just me going there to take photos. I then started making an active effort of inserting myself as this human, as a human species in the multi-species community, and seeing how the different animals interact and how they make home. And then when it came to actual documentation, which I'm gonna get to it right now, specifically the photography, I also wanted to challenge the straightforward way of looking at these animals and environments. I wanted to challenge my usual, most typical human-centric point of view. And so I settled on this somewhat arbitrary approach of photographic at night and using a flashlight to illuminate the stories that I observed during my time there, but that are basically not meant for the everyday Mina Zayed visitor because they happen at night in the middle of the night. And so this is one of the photos. So if you think of these areas as layered, storied niches, as storied habitats, it forces you to consider the narrative that builds up there over time. So this particular corner is actually a feeding station. If you look there at the kind of the right side there, there's a triangle structure. That's where the feeding bowls are and the water bowls are. They're boarded up by the feeders. There are 2 feeders that regularly come to the area, and there's approximately 600 cats in that whole neighborhood. And so one thing to note in the very beginning is the cats claiming the streets. Concrete is warm from the sun that has been shining there the whole day, and the streets are empty and quiet because there are no humans. There's no point of going there outside of the commercial hours. Plus, most of the warehouses are actually out of use right now. And of course, the most striking actor here is the fox. So there are a couple of fox families that are living in the neighborhood, and foxes, specifically the desert foxes here, they are cautious and timid, so they avoid being seen. They only come out after sunset, and they're actually really good at observing without being observed. Interestingly enough, between the foxes and the cats, there's very little recognition. So they're both similar size. They're both there after the food. And so even when the feeders come at night to refill the food, the foxes and the cats wait in line all together. And so that is one way of seeing how the multi-species there, the different actors, how they make life there outside of what we humans are concerned with. And later on, I also observed the foxes, quote unquote, stealing food bowls from the feeding stations. But it was mostly the mother foxes taking the food to their hens, to their dens, which is where the baby foxes were. So again, you also have that certain movement of, in their eyes, I guess, like almost resources. And so I also wanted to point out the glimmering eyes. So you see that pair, you might see that pair. There is also a pair of glimmering eyes there in the bushes. And at night, you get a heightened sense of being watched. So again, there's a certain subjectivity of, first of all, being humans and being narcissistic, assuming that you are the all-seeing eye that sees everything. But in reality, most of the animals and the actors that are there in the area, unless they want something from you, they don't really care about interacting with you. And so it's only really at night with like using something arbitrary as a flash that you get to see all the animals that are hiding. So with this, I was focusing a lot on subjectivity and really looking at basically how the animals and the environment, how they affect each other. Looking at the habitat of Mina Zayed as a layered neighborhood, as a layered habitat, where each species has their own story. And so as a case study, I wanted to include this photo of a cat. Her name is Susie, apparently. This photo was also taken at dusk when the cats started claiming the streets. And luckily, I had access to her personal backstory through one of the feeders. So Susie was a rescue cat and grew up in a home. And a few years later, the owner had to leave the UAE and she couldn't bring Susie with her. So what she ended up doing is she left Susie in Mina Zayed at one of the feeding stations because she knew that they're the feeders and also there aren't the warehouses in this area, they're not in use. So the cats are not as disturbed as in other areas of the city. And in the background, you can also see the tarp boards that are advertising this new creative community that is being constructed there right now. And this was just a moment before Susie began approaching me. And this is a moment of kind of mutual recognition. And for me, when I started learning about her personal story, I kind of like also started thinking about the idea of observing neighborhoods becoming. The phrasing on that board is very funny. But also considering that it's not, first of all, it's not a blank slate. I think that much is clear at the moment. But also the idea of just us looking at what the site is and what can be done and what can be protected there. We're not the only ones with that kind of subjectivity. There's a mutual recognition. There's a see and being seen. And so for me, in this moment of obviously like me being there, researching the cats, trying to observe their daily routines, but also realizing that they've been doing the same. And they've been also doing the same with the whole neighborhoods becoming. And thinking of it as a storied habitat, that they're also part of the witnesses there. And finally, I wanted to mention my exercises in photogrammetry, which is where I used LiDAR technology, light detection and ranging, which is basically like a remote sensing method. Essentially, it uses lasers to register the object that is in front of the camera, and it measures the distance between the laser and the object, and then it basically creates this virtual model of whatever it is that is in front of the camera. And so all that you really need to know is that this is a virtual representation of the actual site that the machine captures. And I wanted to engage in this exercise, firstly, because it is a standard tool for landscapers and engineers and architects, for them to create models of sites that they're working on. And it's a technological point of view, but it also is a human point of view. At the end of the day, you're using technology that has been created by industry professionals to approach and access these different sites. And secondly, by spending time on site there, I realized that the more than human infrastructure is different from what I consider as human infrastructure, even though it's on the very same site. As a human, I will see the plants and the trees and the shrubs as objects or as decor. Whereas for someone that is, let's say, the height of a cat or a desert fox, that in itself is infrastructure. So the shrubs and the bushes, they are not solid bodies. They are the different branches and layers within it. They are also spaces. And so I wondered if I could remap Mina Zayed with a focus on this organic infrastructure, literally meaning mapping out the plants and figuring out what are the different spaces that are available within the organic matter. And then unfortunately, I ran into a problem because the algorithm is calibrated to recognize and predict clear geometry, basically human-built structures. It excels at recognizing architecture and then structures with a very clear, let's say, like triangular geometry. But when it comes to registering organic matter, it struggles with that because there isn't a clear geometry. And so it registers organic matter mostly as texture, and it either abstractizes the subject or it completely flattens it. And so you see in some of the places, the grasses either become these weird bubbles or they just become part of the texture. You can see the cats here, for example, they're basically meshed with the warehouses. which I thought was a pretty funny thing to see. But I realized that if I use the industrial tools or AI powered technology, the result I get looks very similar to the renders that the developers used and where it started off, where you get a clear image of the structures and the buildings and the roads, what we traditionally conceive as infrastructure, right? But this is where I'll kind of end my brief talk today. But unless there is a subjective, visceral, multi-species experience where more than human life is factored in from the very beginning, then our human conception of what an area is becomes both the reference, the reality, and the future plan, where life and agents that fall outside of our urbanistic imaginary become either vague shapes, caricatures of themselves, or just flat out boxed creatures. So that is it in my presentation. I think we can open this up right now to...
Thank you. This is so amazing. I mean, this is even more layers of stuff than when we first discussed the project earlier this week. I'm going to start with the first question, if that's okay. So when you were like, I really like the kind of like I feel like this is getting at those same kinds of ethical questions, right? Like that, how do we render the certain non-humans invisible in our understanding of urban planning and the city. When you were doing the photography, the more standard like videography and photography, how did you make your decisions of like the methodologies of trying to capture the point of view of the cats or the foxes?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at all the different, specifically like the two modes, maybe the at night photography and the day photography, I would shy away from saying that this is from a more than human perspective, because first of all, no matter like what angle I choose, or what I put in the photo, it still is my perspective. So I think for me, that's kind of an undeniable fact that I cannot get away from. And that's why I decided to instead try to insert myself in the environment, and be this like weird oversized human object around these animals, the cats and the foxes that have their own system, and instead approach it like that. So a lot of it comes with genuinely just from the relationships that I managed to build. So even with the foxes, they are timid. They really couldn't care less about being seen or being recognized. But once you become part of that community there, they also started kind of recognizing me, and they stopped completely shying away from me too. And so I think in most of the videography and photography, in like capturing that perspective, it's not so much from the perspective of the animals. It's really more of what the kind of layered stories that you can see in an area once you become more than just a visitor, more than just like a lost little human that is walking around looking at the warehouses. I think that has been mostly my approach. And then, of course, trying to think about that reciprocity of obviously I am walking into a territory that is not mine, that is not my hood, so to speak, right? So there's also a sense of what am I giving back? And in my case, it was mostly food. I thought that was the least that I could do, but also just the kind of respect of me not just going in there just for the photography, but rather than documenting, I guess, yeah, becoming, probably what I'm trying to say is mostly just like becoming part of the habitat that is there, even if I am an oversized human.
Great. And I just have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the floor, which is, we tend to think of cats, other animals, foxes, as representatives of the species, right? Was there a moment in the research where you started recognizing them more as individuals and having more individual relationships with them, and them recognizing you as an individual? Like, was there some kind of shift that happened in the way that you thought about them?
Oh yeah, I think very, very early on. The first time probably that became super clear to me was seeing how the different cats, even within a single colony, how they approach me. And so jokingly, I started referring to a few individual cats as the PR cats of the colony, because there are certain ones that when they would see me come, they're the first ones to appear. So they're the ones to greet, they're the ones that want pets. And they're the ones in a way to see like whether you have food or not. And so they are the kind of personal cats that are curious and interested in why I'm there, who I am. And then there are the other cats that, for example, once you start putting out the food, they would come in only for the food. Then there are the other cats that would actually wait for me to leave, and so then I would only see, for example, in the mirrors of my car that they're coming out only when I start to leave. So I think that was the first time when like it became very clear to me that like okay, all of them have different conceptions of what I am, what my goals are, and why I'm there. But um, the stories, I think at the end of the day, I did get more access to that through the stories that the feeders gave me. So, for example, in the case of Susie, that cat, um, again, the character is very distinct. She is kind of a nonchalant but also snobby cat, and she would come for pets, but she also doesn't really care if you don't give her pets. And so I think once I started learning about her backstory, of how she was a household cat, but then like she was left here, there is that lack of fear of the human element. Um, but at the same time, if I were to completely anthropomorphize her, I would say like, oh, there's a certain betrayal as well. But I think mostly, and I also end with this instance, but also building a relationship with the foxes there. So I think the first one to actually break the ice was one of the little foxes, one of the baby foxes that kept seeing me. And then obviously at some point, curiosity killed the fox. And he started following me. And so there were moments where I saw the den, which again, there was an ethical question for me of like, I don't want to disturb it. This is their home. Foxes are known to be like pretty protective of their dens. But at the same time, I wanted to know just what, like how everything is laid out. Anyway, so after a while, the fox started, I think, recognizing me. And then there was a moment where I was there and I started walking, and the fox just kept like maybe a couple of meters behind, but he started following me. And so I walked probably for a few good blocks, but then following me until eventually what I assume was the mother fox had to physically come and grab her kid and drag him back, saying like, do not interact with that human. And I think it's also moments like that where you realize that like, oh, okay, like there's a certain character that obviously I will not have access to, but by gathering the different stories, even the mothers, I think, that go there stealing the food bowls from the stations, there is that subjectivity that I don't think I wouldn't even try to narrativize it from like a Nat Geo point of view of like, oh, look, the mother foxes, they go foraging and then they bring it back. I think it's really part of these communities having, for such a long time, having inhabited this very particular neighborhood where the way that they forage is mostly going to the stations, is mostly knowing when the feeder's car engines appear and where they're going to stop. So I think also seeing and basically like how they make do the kind of like culture that they establish within that neighborhood.
Question. Just speak up.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This was amazing. Um, I had one follow-up question, which is I hear you mentioning this act of inserting yourself, and I'm curious what that means. I saw one picture of you like sitting on the sidewalk. Like what would it mean to insert yourself? Was it just going there, hanging out for days on an end? And a related question I have is in relation to other non-human factors. Like I'm thinking, especially in a case like this, environment or climate and temperatures, for example. If I think about something like this during the summers, whether it's for the cat or for an artist researcher, Yeah, so I'm wondering how you factor in those other non-human factors. You touched upon the infrastructure and the bushes and the trees, and I'm curious, like, how factors like humidity or heat also, if you've seen that interplay there at all.
Yeah. So to answer the first half of the question, inserting myself from, like, to put it completely plainly, I know that just simply by being present there, I am already disrupting the routine that these more than human communities have. I am not a part of them. And so trying to make myself a part of that habitat is me, first of all, establishing a routine where it's kind of similar to migrating birds. I would migrate to the area for a certain time and then building that rapport and making, for me, also noting down the different specific cats, like we just mentioned, the individuals of the cats, rather than like me just being there and like, oh, what a nice specimen of the species. So you think for me that inserting on myself is one, being completely aware that it's disruptive regardless of what I do. But then trying to figure out how I can make myself part of like the predictable almost element rather than like just a anomaly that happens. And then in terms of the other like climate, for example, factors and infrastructure and everything, um, I shied away from it just a little bit because I think that is also a slightly um I don't know, I think it's easy for me. It would be easy to get lost in like different statistics and then mapping out the like heat maps and then also like trying to graph like the temperature and everything, which is really what I, at least for the first half year that I was engaged in the project, that's exactly what I wanted to get away from. But if anything, um it's observing how the routines of these animals change throughout the year. So, for example, the cats in the summer, yes, you do see a lot less of them, but it's not because they're not there. It's because they're not silly and they hide under the bushes. And they know, because they know the specific engine sounds of the feeders, they don't come out unless they know that the feeders are there. So it's, for example, different things like that, which um, I would say maybe are part of the environment factor, but also is kind of like, again, part of the same multi-species culture that has established there in that area. Okay. Yes, there's a question here. Oh.
Hi, thank you. This is amazing. So, um, I felt like there was also a lesson in art history in a way in your talk about how about the ways of seeing, right? And how we're kind of our ways of seeing is kind of conditioned not to notice multi-species ethnography. And I think that the brilliant point that you also make is that we have also developed imaging technology that is also conditioned to not notice multi-species life. So I want to ask you about your art practices. So is this kind of what you're trying to do, to expose this limitation of our ways of seeing, or are you trying to look for a genuinely capable mode of imaging that to see that makes us capable of noticing this multi-species life?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to say I am looking for a new mode of seeing is a very grand statement that I'm not sure I'm able or that I want to say just now. Um, this is a project that is dear to my heart just because the area is dear to my heart. And like I said, it is right now going through a change. It is going like entering a new chapter and where the community is now becoming kind of the community that has gathered here. And for me, it's, I think, less about accessing the point of view of multi species as a whole. It's really more about looking at this site where I have a personal attachment to it, but then also seeing the conversations and the vendors that are put up on the streets, where, again, what you mostly see are the blank warehouses. And then knowing intuitively and from my own experience that it's not just a blank slate, but at the same time, just saying like, oh, there are trees there, there are animals there, that also feels insufficient. And so I think maybe at some point down the line, I will be able to find like a way of, seeing and photographing from a non-human point of view. But I think at the moment, it is really more about challenging even just this vague notion of cities being built for humans or cities being meant for humans, and instead looking at the ways that non-humans make home there as well, and in the process bringing up questions of also like agency and homemaking as in general, right? Like, what does it mean to build a warehouse complex for a tight-knit community of creatives and academics that is, in a way, like, to use a very crass term, stolen land from like the animals that have been there from the very beginning, right? So it's more those questions rather than like a like a groundbreaking new way of looking. That makes sense.
If I could just add something to that, I think this is really interesting and important in terms of thinking about, when we talk about gentrification, we only talk about the human impacts of gentrification, sometimes the environmental impacts. But it seems like, when we talked about this a little bit in the other session, that it's some of the more neglected neighborhoods or less sanitized, less modernized neighborhoods in the UAE that have all of these like multi-species spaces. And what is gentrification doing on a multi-species level, I think, is a really important question to ask.
Yeah, and for me, it's just the very idea of cities being built for humans, which to me is a very naive idea. Even having just this mental image of a sterile city, which is also like, what does that mean? Like, does it mean that it only has plants that come from a nursery that are all offsprings from a single species, that everything is tightly designed? Because that's never going to happen. Everything is connected, and if we were to sterilize everything, we wouldn't be able to be here. So I think for me, there's also that of like, when you're in the process, unless you consider that, like, the cats, the different animals, they're going to be there regardless. They're going to find their way. And so you either end up in a loop of like just perpetually sending them somewhere and then new ones coming in, and then down the line, I don't know, like the different fungi taking over because there are no cats to provide the poop that would contain it. It's like things like that are way beyond the typical kind of human consideration of what building on a plot of land is.
Sorry, I talk a lot. I'm a ISO certified crazy cat lady. I used to live in Abu Dhabi. I used to go to Mina Port to the fish restaurants. And I was there 2008, 2019. The area was different. The restaurants were regularly like kiosk type. Now it's been turned into like a mall. So I think even human beings there, restaurant owners, are adapting to the urbanization of the area. And I don't see the cats as when I go there as much as I used to before. When I was looking at this, I was thinking of a documentary about urbanization and cats called Kedi. It's about the cats in Istanbul, and I like that because they didn't tackle like feeding cats. It's like how cats are equal living beings in a city. They just focused on the characteristics of certain cats and the characteristics of certain human beings, and how they're trying to cohabitate in a huge city. And just one more comment, thinking about urbanization and animals, there's one Palestinian movie that comes to mind. I don't know if many people have seen it. It's called Girafada. It's about the West Bank. They had a zoo, and it's based on a real story. There was an attack, and there were two giraffes. So they were a couple. One of them died, and the surviving mate became depressed and needed a partner. So one of the guys in the zoo was trying to find a giraffe. So he contacted someone in Israel to smuggle a giraffe to the zoo in the West Bank zoo to try so that giraffe does not die out of depression. I think it's an interesting way of tackling like how even animals have to deal with a war zone, not just a human being. And I think it's interesting because when you look at Palestinian movies, the first image you see is fighting and killing. But this was just tackling a human story about how animals are trying to survive in a zoo, in a war zone.
That's so funny because I heard a somewhat similar story, but about a zoo in Egypt. Maybe it was like one of them is derivative of the other. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. In the story that I know in Egypt, a new giraffe was flown in from South Africa, and then the original depressed giraffe was being transported to another zoo, and somehow in the truck the giraffe got loose, and so for a while it was flailing in the wind, just feeling free, and then crossed the bridge, and unfortunately the original giraffe that was depressed, was decapitated, on the highway. Yeah. So the story that I know was an imported giraffe that was brought in as a friend, but then needed a new friend. Um, but yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And also the idea, I think, of like the kedi, and then also the other point that you made also brings up the question of nativity, right? Like being native, like being part of the local culture. Um, and uh, yeah, in a way, also just thinking about what the natural environment tells about the location where they are at. So the palms say one thing, the different shrubs say another thing. Falcons also tell a certain story, but it's not a coincidence that there's a particular kind of cat that is also present here. And so I think it's also like the perspective of like what is valuable, what is important. And I think unfortunately a lot of times that also is tied to financial value, of just seeing like what is financially viable and what is not, right?
I have a question
Go ahead.
for both. Yeah, thank you for your research. Have you considered asking, like, while you said about technology and using technology through your videos, have you considered asking ChatGPT or AI how would a cat look at a human being, how they do see you while you were there or something, like to know more and dive more? Have you used the AI and ChatGPT
That's
in
a
your
good
research?
question. It didn't cross my mind to ask ChatGPT how a cat would perceive me, but I think it's a curious way of approaching technology. I might try that.
A friend and I had a entire series of novellas that we had ChatGPT write with the protagonist being wombats. But this is a whole other story. But I think one of the things that your work brings up that's really interesting and very exciting. And I think it overlaps with the kinds of things that I'm thinking about is this idea of a multi-species right to the city, right? And what would that look like? And in Istanbul, we can see it a little bit, right? In some, like I just came back from Morocco in June, and you can see it is more of an accepting place of multi-species. Whereas here, now the UAE environmental plan has listed cats as invasive species, right? So who gets to decide who's invasive? Who gets to decide who's foreign? Who's temporary? I think these questions are where we can locate the links also between immigration and the non-human, right?
Absolutely. 100%.
I have a related question. And being allergic to cats, perhaps, I've had to shift my lens of observation a bit. And in the entire time I've been here, I've found a great affinity with birds, right? Um, and migratory birds in particular. Like I found great comfort in my recognition of certain species that are particularly African or South Asian, Also because they imply this kind of lack of control as well. Like there's really no way to keep them out. And you have this probably false notion that they have some sort of freedom. And mynas apparently here have also been classified as an invasive species. And I've seen, I guess, since I've kind of moved to the ground floor quite recently, I see that when the cats are done at the feeders, the menas come and they eat whatever is left of the cat food. And I wondered if in Mina Zayed as well, there was some kind of circularity between what's on the ground and what's in the air and how they...
Yeah, there was. So there are quails in the area which stay on the ground. but apparently they survive. I know maybe in dire times when the feeders forget their schedule, the cats tap into that inventory. But that is one thing. I mentioned that because they have a very specific song that echoes throughout the entire area. And so before I ever even saw them, I knew they were there just because it rings all throughout the neighborhood. And actually, the circularity of especially like similar to the foxes coming in when the feeders come and then taking a little bit from the food. In Mina's Ayat, it's the crows. So there are two particular crows that I noted that when the feeders come, they also go from side to side, but they only show their face once the feeders are gone. And so this was another thing where I managed to saw in the rearview mirror. There was the same two crows that were landing, and specifically the feeders that sometimes bring the fresh fish from the fish market. That's when the crows would come in, and they actually do follow the feeders from side to side to side. But I guess trying to play the game of like, do not be seen. And there is at least one parakeet that I managed to see. I'm sure there are more, but perhaps they're more skittish there. But I think, again, mynas were initially, it is assumed that they were introduced because people were bringing them in as pets, and that eventually, whether intentionally or not, they got out, similar to parakeets, and they're now considered invasive species. But they came in from these port areas. And so I think there's also that question of one, human agency and like deciding who you want to bring and who you don't want to bring. But then also that's to use like kind of a charged term, but like reparations in a way. It's they didn't come here by accident. So I think then it forces you to assume a less human-centric view also of what do we do. But yeah, they're definitely birds. But it is difficult to get to know them because they move so fast.
But they also return to the same spots every day if you...
Yeah, as with the
Long
crows.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to do the unforgivable sin of offering a comment without a clear question. But the LiDAR, for me, it seems as if it's less of a bias in terms of development, not like, the camera was developed with certain biases, and more of a technological limitation that prevents LiDAR from capturing anything that moves, right? So the bias is like even these plants here aren't even being captured well. It also that's complicated by its inability to capture things of various degrees of like glossy surfaces and stuff like that as well. But what I do see here as being successfully documented is the structures, which you've already talked about. And I find that this is a very fascinating sort of juxtaposition between the things that are not being able to capture those with movement, which would include humans, by the way. A human would also appear kind of flat and boxy and whatever. But the structure, looks permanent, right? And we have this sense or this sort of ingrained belief that, yeah, what's there will stay. I find that almost like a metaphor for our own human existence. It's like whenever we do focus outward, we start to challenge our own self-perception of being permanent. And here we are, just a drop in this 14 point whatever billion years of universe that we can see. So
That's a good comment. I think extremely relevant, actually. So I wouldn't say, I think it's a redeemable sin. But I think, yes, it's a shortcoming just with technology itself. But do we notice that technology? I think then the question is that just a quirk of it and we continue using it without questioning it? Or do we recognize that it's one thing to create a virtual model and then recognize that, like, oh, there are certain elements that like it did not capture, but knowing that they are there. And it's another thing bringing these models into, to the drawing board and then developing new master plans and figuring out what you do with the area when along the way within the process, just because of the way, like the shortcomings of technology, those moving subjects become erased. And so I think that's the case where for me it is kind of problematic that then eventually you trust the technology, it's supposed to be objective, but then what you get is almost like a blank slate and you then evaluate the warehouses, what is supposed to be renovated and so on. But then everything around it starts to feel a little bit like a glitch almost, right? So it becomes easy to erase it and I think it begs the question of like, what are the long-term effects, I guess. and also even speaking of justice, right? Like justice within cities, is that even obviously not a just way, in my opinion. But I was thinking about like us planning the future, these current shortcomings, where do they come in?
Ask you one more question. Do we have time for one more question? Yeah. To bring it more anthropocentric, can you have you spoken to the feeders? Can you tell us about the feeders? Who are they? What are the reasons that they do what they do? How many are there?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, there are two kind of permanent feeders. So they come, each of them, twice a week, every single week. There's a lady, Miss Maria. She is a housewife, originally from the Philippines. And so for her, I think it's mostly just a weakness of the heart. In the sense that for her, I think it's kind of like she doesn't even question it. She's like, oh, there's like suffering in front of me. Of course I'm gonna help. But um, it's interesting because when you talk about like species and representatives, I think that like sometimes people that are in those feeder communities, they also become certain archetypes. And so I think like she is very, very kind of forthcoming. She's a powerhouse, just like in a single lady. She like has had disputes even with the municipality. And so at least in Abu Dhabi, she actually managed to pass a law. I don't know how widely it is publicized, but for dumping an animal onto the street, is actually a finable offense. So there's a fine of just 1,000 dirhams, of course. But you can actually report that. And it's all thanks to her, like her being like, what is this? No, I need to talk to them. So that is one of the feeders. And the other feeder is, he tells me to call him Babu, originally from Kerala. And honestly, in his case, he comes sometimes with his wife. They're a little bit cagey, and I think most of it is due to a certain lack of trust as to why anyone would want to even research this area. So Miss Maria, for example, she was very proactive and like even telling me like, oh, there are these dogs. Can you buy dog food? I'll give you dog food. Can you just go? So she's the kind of person to like mobilize and organize. Whereas Babu and his wife, I think, again, there's a certain probably betrayal from the past, where for them, he didn't even give me his phone number. He was like, please just don't photograph the cats or like don't show the area because then someone will report it and someone will come here. And so even when I tried to explain, like, no, I'm doing this just as research, I'm not gonna, like, I do not want to endanger this area. I don't know, there's, I think, a certain like personal kind of commitment to it is them being in a way like the caretakers of them and wanting good, but then also the hesitance to let an outsider in. And then there are less regular feeders that come and go, but these are the two people that, you know, we're almost like custodians of the stations there. I left it out of the presentation because, again, it's a very human-centric thing, but certain anecdotes from them made their way into the presentation. Yeah. I feel like it's been a long conversation. Very good. Yeah.
Thank you to every Shama. Thank you, Shama, and for organizing all of this.